Welcome to the video lecture for Chapter 12 in the Hick textbook. This chapter speaks to the issue of disability and income support. Many people think of disability as something that's rare, but if you look at the statistics provided by Hick, we see that there's a significant population within Canadian society of people who live with disabilities. The better we are at detecting and understanding disability, the more disabilities we're able to categorize and capture. So our capacity and our technologies for assessment are part of the reason why we may see an increase, or we have seen an increase, in the number of people identified as living with a disability. In particular, our capacity to assess and detect learning disabilities is something that has greatly increased the people who understand themselves as living with a learning disability. I expect that the folks who are studying psychology will find this particularly interesting because there are many psychologists who study the ways in which we can engage in assessment of people living with disabilities so that we can provide them with what some people would understand as the best standardized solution to their experience of disability. Of course, one of the challenges with this process of assessing, detecting, and then responding to something like a learning disability is that it really frames disability as a state of lacking, as a less than, as something that requires intervention. And we know that many people do not experience disability in this way. They see it instead as a kind of diversity, as a particular way of knowing about the world and experiencing the world, and that knowledge and understanding and experience contributes positively to society. I've just been talking about disability, but disability requires some problematization, I guess. The phrase disability suggests that everyone fits into one particular category, but we know that the experience of disability is diverse and falls across a continuum of experience. As a result, it can be a challenge to provide social welfare supports and resources to people living with disabilities, at least in a standardized way. There are definitely ways and means to provide good service and good supports to people living with disability. We just have to make some decisions about how we allocate resources and how we understand what it means to solve a problem, and in fact, to understand what the problem is. The PALS survey, or the Participation and Activity Limitation Survey, discussed by Hick in the text, gives us another opportunity to think about the relationship between the experiences of Canadians in a national sense and processes of globalization. So we see that this survey brings into a Canadian context a set of criteria and understandings constructed by the World Health Organization and the United Nations. What's interesting about this survey is that it looks at experiences of chronic illness and disability from a holistic perspective, considering how it affects people in a multidimensional way. I've included a link to information about the PALS surveys that were completed over a number of years in a Canadian context on Blackboard. So you might want to go and have a look because the Statistics Canada webpage for this survey is quite interesting. In about 2011, 2012, the PALS survey was replaced with the Canadian Survey on Disability, which updated and upgraded a number of the measures that were used to understand people's global experience. And when I say global, I mean general, holistic understanding as opposed to globalized understanding of their life with disability. Knowing, of course, that many people who might have experiences where they have to modify particular behaviors or require assistive devices don't necessarily understand themselves as disabled. The Canadian Survey on Disability still uses global measures, but the point of this survey is to really plan the kinds of resources and supports, the kinds of funding models and approaches that governments will have to put in place in order to be able to meet the needs of people who we understand to be living with a disability. Like most social policies in Canada, the history of services and resources for people living with disabilities relate back to the understandings of social welfare constructed through the British Poor Law. You might remember from the previous course, if you took the Intro to Social Work course, and some of the early discussions in the first two PowerPoint presentations in this course, the British Poor Law saw disability as something that made someone eligible for government support. Initially, this support came in the form of permission to beg, but later on, there were almshouses and charitable relief that was provided to people living with disability. There were very few resources and supports to allow people with disabilities to participate fully in society. There were very few opportunities for education or training opportunities until we get to probably about the 1970s. I'm sure there are a few exceptions to this rule, but generally speaking, government in Canada did not have a comprehensive plan until around that time, beyond institutionalization, which is a model that really does reflect the approach of the British Poor Law system. There was, and to some degree still is, stigma associated with disability. Historically, the stigma was linked to notions of morality, as many of our social welfare philosophies are. So families who had a person with a disability within the family might understood to be paying for some kind of moral transgression, that a disability might be understood as a punishment from God or some kind of test that a family's strength had to endure. And so this model of stigmatizing people who lived with disabilities and their family members supported institutionalization and institutional models of care for people with disabilities, where people would be removed from their family and placed in institutions that were essentially closed off from the general public. We might think of this as something that occurred a long time ago, but we know that just a few years ago, large institutional centers like Huronia closed, moving the people who had been residents of Huronia into smaller group home and community-based programs for people with disabilities. But an institution like Huronia reminds us of the fact that we're not that far away from this stigmatization, severe stigmatization of disability, and the desire to have disabled people removed and apart from the general population. We can associate some of the changes in attitude towards disability with World War I. Many people experienced disability, both medical and psychiatric, resulting from the war. What we now refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder might have at one time been referred to as shell shock. And so this presence of disability within society, disabilities produced through human action, forced people to have a new consideration or a new understanding of disability. These noble disabilities forced a reevaluation of all disabilities, and also meant that we were investing new technologies and new resources in solutions to people's experiences of disability. Of course, solutions assumes that disability is not a normal state. And so those of you who are interested in critical perspectives on disability might elect to take some courses in critical disability theory in order to learn more about what I mean when I talk about the idea of normalization. Traditionally, medical model approaches to disability have been the primary way in which we address issues of disability in society, and certainly up until about the 1970s, and probably a little bit later than that, this was the primary way we addressed disability in Canadian society. The challenge with a medical model approach is that it's based in the individual, and it's based on what some scholars would refer to as normalization. Normalization assumes that there is a normal and a natural state of the body, that bodies are meant to function in a particular way, and that a whole body functions in a particular way. A body that does not function in that way is somehow defective. So it might need to have a diagnosis and a cure applied so that the person can be returned to a state of normal. And if that cannot occur, then the next best thing is to apply technologies and other kinds of resources to that body so that it can function in what might be described as a most normal way. The challenge with this, of course, is that it really limits what we understand as a body and what we understand as the way that people should function in the world. It disregards all the interesting possibilities that disability brings to our community, to our society. And so rights-based disability approaches work on the basis of an equity model. There are different things that different people need in order to be able to function in the world that they want to function in the way that they want to function in it. And so it challenges people, it challenges the society, groups of people, to develop alternative solutions and alternative ways of understanding disability. So when we look at things like universal design or universal design in educational programs, these encourage us to see disability as something that will be present in a group of people, and that many people can benefit from the kinds of resources and supports that can be put in place when we take up this challenge of a universal design. Most people can use a ramp to get into a building. Many people have difficulties with stairs. So to some degree, it's about changing attitudes and changing approaches when we opt for a rights-based approach rather than a medical model approach to disability. Rights-based approaches really do invite us to think about the way in which government policy shapes how we approach issues like disability. We certainly know that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was established in Canada in 1982, is an important way of embedding or ensuring that rights-based approaches have a place in Canada's responses to disability. There's a typo in this slide. If you look in the last bullet, it says shit. I didn't write that. It came from the publisher like that, and it should actually be shift. So again, really this is reinscribing what I said in the previous slide. A movement from a medical model to a rights-based approach demands a different kind of response to the issue of disability. People have a right to participate fully in society, which means that governments and other institutions within society have a responsibility to provide resources to people living with disability so that they might participate more fully or have the opportunity to participate as fully as they would like to. Independent living models are an example of this rights-based approach. So if we understand part of our desire in a liberal humanist context to actualizing our full potential, then living independently or as independently as possible might be one of the ways that we actualize this full potential. So the independent living movement is a movement towards ensuring that people have the resources that they need in order to be able to live as independently as possible. For some people that means fully independently. For other people that may mean a group home setting, or it might mean living with attendant care if one requires assistance with some aspects of daily living. Consumer rights approaches to disability emphasize the idea that living with a disability gives people a very special kind of knowledge about disability. Unless you live with the experience, it's hard to know about the nuances of obstacles, challenges, and barriers that people may face. So this perspective really sees this lived experience as something that can inform in an important way changes to things like the environment, the social attitudes, the economic and funding realities of services to people with disabilities in a way that responds to the needs and desires of people who are living in this context. We talked about historical stigma, but there is stigma that still exists, a significant amount of stigma that negatively affects people living with disabilities. As a result, it is important for us to continue to do things like engage in public education, to do our own self-reflection, to try and learn more in order to eliminate things like stereotyping of people who live with disabilities or attitudes that people who go to school, for example, with disabilities get special treatment if they receive some kind of accommodation to help support their success in school. Ableism is one of the ways in which stigma shows itself. So assumptions are made about the capability of people with disabilities, and there's an assumption that if you are a person who lives without a disability, that you are somehow superior to people who live with disability. And we know that this is simply not the case. And so this is something that requires, again, that kind of attitudinal change, kind of reflective contemplation about how we might perpetrate ableism when we're engaged in helping work like social work or psychology or sociology. We've talked about the idea that resources and economic factors are important aspects of disability rights and ensuring that people living with disability have resources and supports to allow them to actualize their full potential. And so income security programs are part of the package of resources that would allow people to function well in society. I'm not sure that we've really provided enough resources to people, but we are going to have a look at some of the programs. And we've already talked about some of these in more detail in other slides. So we know that under the Canada Pension Plan, there is a disability pension allowance. We also know that general welfare assistance, or in our case, Ontario Works, provides the Ontario Disability Support Program to people living with disability. And we know as well that there may be some family benefits, for example, benefits through CPP or OAS, that are paid to the family members of people living with disabilities to help support their care. But we also have some private programs, for example, long-term disability insurance that you might pay into at work. And we might also talk about WSIB as something that could potentially be providing support to people living with disability if their disability was acquired on the job. Accessing public disability benefits is an arduous process. So if you're receiving ODSP, you're receiving ODSP because you've gone through a long screening process requiring medical documentation, information affidavits, potentially examinations by particular kinds of practitioners in order to prove that you are disabled based on the definitions of disability embraced by the social assistance system. All of the income support programs that provide financial resources and other kinds of benefits to people living with disability have screening and eligibility requirements. Each of these are different, each of these have different forms, each of these have different definitions. For some people, they may actually access more than one resource, which would require them to do multiple applications, multiple assessments, and to provide multiple forms of documentation. It's not easy to access disability benefits in Canada. It's a lot of work, and social workers are often involved in this process, and I'm sure in many cases psychologists are also involved, providing assessments and documentation. Sociologists, I'm not sure. you probably have a role in the design of the programs. But this is something for us to think about if we're moving forward and entering the workforce and considering working in these areas. Are there ways in which we, in the way that we approach the assessment policies and processes, able to make this a better experience for people? If you go to work every day, you might wake up some mornings and say, "Oh, I wish I didn't have to work today." But we know that work is important. It certainly brings monetary resources to people, but it brings a lot of other resources to people as well. So, for example, it may give you a sense of identity. I know for me, being a social worker is something that's important to the way that I understand who I am. It may also bring relationships into your life. There are many people that I know who center almost all of their relationships in their work life. It may give you a sense of accomplishment. It may keep you mentally stimulated. It may help you beat boredom or depression. So work's really important. But for a lot of people living with disability who are receiving income support from government programs or through government programs, or even through some private programs, they're very limited in their ability to participate in work. If they participate in work, they may lose some or all of their benefits. This is something that disability rights advocates have identified as a real problem, because there are more things that come with work than money. And when people can't participate in the workforce, then they're limited in their capacity to function socially, because our society is so much involved with work as the center of how people understand who they are. And we could argue that we ought to make some changes to that, but it is part of the reality that we live with now. So, many programs have been developed to support people with disabilities accessing and participating in work without losing their benefits. We also know that people who live with disability experience severe poverty. And so the capacity to increase their income through work participation is another important part of the rights movement within disability, because people who live with disability ought to have the capacity to have the same levels of income of people who aren't disabled. The challenge, of course, is the potential for exploitation, and there are a number of programs that I've heard about that make me question how the programs have been set up. So what's important is to ensure that the work of people who live with disability is work of equal value, and that they get paid equally for their contribution to the economy through their labor. The barriers that people living with disability face from a financial point of view in relationship to income support programs is one element that requires change. But the culture and realities of the workplace are another area of change. For some people, entering the workforce would require a particular kind of accommodation in order to allow that person to function well in the workplace. These requirements have, in many circumstances, prevented employers from hiring people with disabilities. However, legislation and other programs have been developed in order to support employers to provide accommodations to people functioning in the workplace. Not everybody requires an accommodation, and there are limits on the kinds of accommodations that an employer has to put in place. It can't put other workers at risk or put the person doing the job at risk. It can't create a significant financial burden for the employer or change the nature of the work. But legislation does mean that employers have an obligation to accommodate workers in the workplace. This concludes our lecture on Chapter 12. Thanks very much for listening. Believe it or not, we're getting close to the end of the course, so I'll look forward to connecting with you in the next video lecture.